course. All right, welcome everyone. Today is Wednesday, November 13th, 2024, and I'm happy to welcome Jim Steele for a talk on what?
I'm going to do the Permian extinction.
The Permian extinction. Take it away, Jim.
And I'll refer to Michael, who was talking about a woman going crazy on him for being a denier like he is. I've had people attack me just for questioning the climate change issue. You're going to cause us all to go extinct. So as I'm an ecologist, so I'm always looking at, my whole career of looking at how ecosystems change and evolve. So this has always attracted my attention. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint, and at any time, stop me for clarification, stop me for questions. I encourage you to do that whenever I say something you don't understand.
And a brief background, please.
I was born as a young boy, 1951, but I served as a director for San Francisco State University Sierra Nevada Field Campus, as an environmental education campus. So I did that for 25 years. And as I did different ecosystem studies, I became more of a climate scientist, because out here in California, El Niños, La Niñas affect us tremendously. We also have a Mediterranean climate, so we have high fire danger. So there's many things that all feed into all the narratives that you're hearing about climate change that I had to get to understand better. And I had some of, when I first started, there was a whole thing about butterflies fleeing to the north and going extinct due to climate change by Camille Parmesan. But I had teaching for me there classes, North America's best butterfly expert. And we would often walk places and say, we don't see what she's talking about. And when I try to verify what she did, she didn't have any of the data in her paper that was in Nature, and all the news media was pushing Parmesan stuff. And I called her up and said, can I see some of your data? I'd like to check and verify what you're saying. They said, no, I'm not giving you my data. So at that point, I became a little pissed that there's not everything is above board. It's not good science. And so I just went on to a whole lot of other things. And now I'm just an ardent climate skeptic. And it's dangerous in San Francisco to be one, but I'm tough. So anyways, that's me as much of a nutshell as I can give you. So I'm going to put up my PowerPoint. Am I sharing now? Are we seeing this?
No, you need the green share button.
Oh. I see. And hit share there.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah.
And, all right. So the end Permian is sort of also known as the Great Dying. And it happened right at the transition from what we call the Paleozoic, which is all these different animals and plants that were evolved early, versus the Mesozoic and Neozoic, or Cenozoic, where you have the plants and animals we see today, or much except for the dinosaurs. And there's the theory that gets pushed the most is,
Jim, this is 250 million years ago. Is that where we are?
About 251 million, give or take a million.
Okay.
The most common way of saying, oh, it's global warming. Volcanoes cause the release of all the CO2 that cause rapid warming, and that caused these extinctions. And and do you see this? I'm seeing people's faces, but they're blocking half of what I'm showing. But do you see the whole thing?
We do. You can move. You can move us around and get us.
Yeah, well, that's I know mostly what I'm going to say, but it's the reason Permian was considered the Great Dying is like 57% of all the biological species were went extinct. 81%, 70%, a tremendous loss. But when you do percentage, you lose a certain perspective. What's your starting point when you're talking about percent? But it became the Permian has sort of been used by the media to say, the planet has sudden warming before and it wiped out almost everything. So global warming can do the same thing. And that's why I get these nutcases. They really think we're going to go extinct if we let CO2 go a little bit higher. So I'm going to offer to you my theory, which is based on a lot of stuff that's in the published science, that it's actually low CO2 that cause the end Permian extinction. And the part of the reason the way they focus on extinctions, they focus on it in a very small scale of time and place. So they have 5 great extinctions. You normally have periods of biodiversity increasing, originations of new species, and then you have die-offs. And so there's a back and forth. And when it exceeds the certain background of extinctions, they call it a mass extinction. And so there's 5 currently, there could be 6 or 7, but these are the 5. And if you look at the Permian, they say, well, it's volcanic activity, it increased CO2 that caused rapid global warming, and that's what killed it. And that's just one of the theories. But they also look at what we do know from data, that there was a lot of the oceans went anoxic. They lost a lot of their oxygen. They had the lands were drying, so you had a lot of desertification, which people say, well, warming is going to cause less oxygen in the water and it's going to cause more evaporation and more deserts. But there's many other causes for those same phenomena, which is what I'm going to try to look at. They also mentioned the Triassic was due to the same thing, which is around the same time. But if you look earlier, the Ordovician, it was rapid global cooling that caused the great extinctions. And the same thing with the end Devonian. And so the first thing you want to look at is, okay, how does CO2 and temperature affect that? You would expect this rapid cooling, this CO2 to be very low, and there's several different exact measurements for CO2 and temperature. But if you look at the Ordovician where it was cooling, you see CO2 is around 4,000, which would be a lot higher than now. So it doesn't seem like you should have that much cooling if CO2 is that high. You also look at the end Devonian, which you still see that CO2 is above 1,000, but they say the extinctions there were due to CO2. So only in the Permian does this data show that you had a rising temperature and rising CO2. So that's what they go with. So it's really kind of a very narrow look. They have their blinkers on. Well, here now we can show a CO2, and that's why it's dangerous for us. And the last one, Cenozoic, is I think most people agree it's the asteroid hit and caused a lot of problems. But what's going to part for their correlation, you have to have the timing of when CO2 is percentage and when the temperatures, and you have to have them correlate. Well, there's other studies, you sort of have the same cold Ordovician, high CO2, same thing with the Devonian. But here at the Permian, you have CO2 staying very low into the Triassic, yet you have very high temperatures at that time. So for me, it just says that the correlation between CO2 and temperatures are not that strong, that there's other things that have to be looked at. For whatever effect CO2 is having, something else major is happening, because these data just don't fit what we're expecting. The other thing is they tend to look, because of most of our thinking is like an asteroid hit and caused almost this instantaneous extinction, that I choose to look at, and what's becoming a little more popular is this idea of dead clades walking. It's not something that happened instantaneous, but happens over millions of years as you affect diversity for different reasons. And when you look at it from that perspective, you see that long period of very low CO2 from the Carboniferous to the Permian, that I believe that it's the reduced amount of CO2 reduces photosynthesis, and that collapses the food webs. And so what I try to do is give you a lot of data that shows it supports that and offers a counter explanation to the things that people are saying is blamed on warming and high CO2. So if I go back to this picture of just CO2, we see that there's been this steady decline. And so a lot of our early organisms evolved in high CO2. They were easily able to get a lot of CO2 for photosynthesis. there was a tremendous amount of biodiversity that happened in the Ordovician, and then it steadily declined until you got to the Carboniferous and Permian. And what we know is from greenhouse gas experiments and greenhouses and whatever, that 1,000 parts per million is good for photosynthesis. But when you get below that, you start making photosynthesis reduced. And so the Permian happened, and if you don't look at it as just the end Permian, but you look at it as dead clades walking over 100 million years, you start to get a different picture that makes a lot more sense if you don't limit yourself just to the end Permian. Is everybody with me so far? All right, and just to show that what we know just recently, if you add more CO2 above what we have, we've been seeing a greening of the globe. The plants benefit from higher CO2 because we all have that legacy chemistry, biochemistry of photosynthesis from back in the Cambrian. So it has different issues. Well, if there was dead clades walking, well, maybe we would see different plants react as the CO2 collapsed. Well, the botanists, they don't see 5 major extinctions of plant life. They really only see 2. And the first happens at the Carboniferous, where the rainforest collapsed. Now, these plants, these are giant trees that are lycopods, very primitive in many different reasons. The only ones that survived are much smaller. And the ones on the right, isoetes, I've seen it in ponds up in the Sierras, or club mosses. Some people put them in their terrariums. Very small plants. They don't have seeds, but spores, so that limits them in different ways. But you had this major collapse of the Carboniferous rainforest before the Permian started. And all these major wetland tree species died out. And it's why they think this is one of the big botanical mass extinctions, which is not listed in the other 5. But it started something. If you collapse these rainforests, and now what you have is drought-tolerant plants start to increase, and these moisture-dependent plants have decreased, you're changing all these ecosystems. And as I do my work in the Sierras, you go to a wetland and a dryland, much different animals, much different species. So this collapse started to change everything. And a lot of this is due to a drying out of the land due to plate tectonics, which I'll talk about a little more. But as you go through the Permian, these are the different stages. About 20 million years before the Permian extinction, they had what you call the Olson extinction. And for a while, people didn't even recognize it, but there was a loss of 45% of the plants at that time. And then you go to the Capitanian, which is about 7 to 10 million years before the end Permian, another 56% of the plant species were lost. So there's this continual loss of different plant species, changing all these ecosystems that would change all the animal species. And not until you get to the end Permian, where there was about another 50% more of the plants, do they die off. But these 2 endpoints are what the botanists think were the major changes in plants. And that has to do with what was happening here. But you can see what this idea of dead clades walking, as you kept changing things over the last 50 million years from the Carboniferous to the Permian, there was huge changes going on. So to just say it was the end Permian where everything all of a sudden went because you had high CO2, it's like they're forcing the issue to make it agree with their climate change beliefs. You can see that when you look at coal deposits. The coal deposits stopped in the Permian after the rainforest collapsed. The lycopods that did most of the coal, the fossilized wood, came from those lycopods that are no longer around, the lycopod tree species. And the coal deposit didn't start coming back until a bit later. Maybe with all you English folks who are big on coal, or were big, you might correct me on any of this, but it goes along with that idea of this rainforest collapse, all of a sudden cause these big forests to die off during the Permian. If you think that the plants are going to change the animal species, so you look at through the Permian, the different stages, we see that there was huge losses amongst corals and brachiopods and conodonts and different things in the ocean in the early Permian. You see the ammonoids had a 30 million year long decline. before the end Permian. The Olson extinction, again, some places had 80% of their vertebrate extinctions happen during that time. And then by the Capitanian, there was 75% of the Permian coral families had disappeared. And those coral back then in the Paleozoic didn't have the symbiosis with the coral we have right now. So they were much more susceptible. They're just filter feeders. If you have less phytoplankton, you have less food falling to them, so they didn't do well, they went extinct. And by the end Capitanian, 7 to 10 million years before the end Permian, they have 47% of all the marine invertebrate genera went extinct. So again, this dead clades walking shows that everything kind of built up to this end Permian of a tremendous loss of life that it couldn't survive. And then you had the final end Permian. If you look at a chart of genera of phytoplankton as they went from the Cambrian to modern day, you see these little triangles are showing spikes in new species, number of genera, and then you see an extinction happening. And you had the Ordovician was here, but whoops. But you see this decline, steady decline in the number of species right around where the rainforest collapse happened. You also tend to have hardly any new species of phytoplankton show up. And then you have these bursts of new genera, but they decline. And so the final end Permian, when they say, oh, this is tremendous loss of life, there was a lot more life being lost in a series of several different extinctions down to end Permian. Now, the only thing in this chart that looks like, well, if CO2, collapsed CO2, how come everything is more and more species? But that's because we have new plants. They have new adaptations to low CO2 that have allowed them to survive after this and create more diversity. So one thing about diversity is the smaller the number of species, new species you have to counteract the background. So some species are just genetically capable of radiating. So if you look at the honey creepers that went to Hawaii, the birds there didn't have predators, but they had some biodiversity that in their genetics that allowed them to have tremendous different colors, tremendous different beaks, feed on tremendously different kinds of food supplies, and just radiate out into a lot of new species. And then for one example, is the state bird is the nene, which is a relative of a Canada goose that landed in Hawaii and decided to stay. And the changes there are very small. So some species that survive can multiply a number of new species and some can't. So it depends on who you got left. But as you have fewer and fewer species in total, you're going to have fewer chances of more biodiversity being generated, like you see with the honey creepers. A lot of the plants that exist today are much more resilient because the up into the Permian, you really didn't have any seed plants. You had a few, they were starting to evolve. But we know that these seeds allow you to weather tremendous changes in climate over thousands of years. Now, some seeds we have today won't survive more than a year, but they've pulled up these three plants. They're kind of the oldest seeds that we know that could functionally germinate. But one was 2,000 years old. The sacred lotus was 1,300 years old, and they had a silene, which is a small herbal type plant. It's 32,000-year-old seed, and it was still able to germinate. So when you're comparing things after the Permian extinction, you got to understand that the plants that evolved later had a lot more changes to adapt to climate change. So if I look at this is looking at the number of genera through since the Cambrian. And so you have this tremendous diversity in the Ordovician time. And you have extinction, so it goes back and forth. But as CO2 decreased, the number of new species also decreased. So everything that evolved here evolved when you had CO2 4,000, 5,000 parts per million. And then as it goes down to 120, what we see is here is very few new species evolve. And what we also see is what they find very few spores or cysts from green algae. And it's been called the phytoplankton blackout, where it's very rare to find them. So it almost looked like starting the Carboniferous to the Triassic, most of the phytoplankton started to die off. They just don't find it. Now, the battle becomes with that is, well, is it because they didn't get preserved? Or is it because they actually died? Or is it that we have bad observations? We just don't see them. So there's a little bit of debate. What some people argue about this phytoplankton blackout, so they said, well, they didn't see a lot of the fish die off the same way they saw the plankton. So something must be wrong with that. And the idea is, why are marine phytoplankton so sensitive? And I'll talk about that. But the idea was, if we still see a lot of fish, then it can't be plankton, because when we think of a aquatic food web, we think of phytoplankton photosynthesizing, making organic a material that the zooplankton can eat, and then the small and big fish eat the zooplankton. But only really in the last 20 years, I think this idea of the microbial loop has been understood, where you can have all this dissolved organic matter floating in the ocean, and there's tons of it. Or you can have particulate organic matter that's been stored there for hundreds of years. These bacteria can feed on it. And the bacteria will get in clusters. You'll have bacteriivores, they're like zooplankton, can eat the bacteria. And that can feed the zooplankton. And that can feed the fish. So you can maintain, if you can maintain a lot of this organic matter in the ocean, then you can still maintain the fish even if your phytoplankton died out. So that's a question. People follow me on this? No question? Well, the one thing they also ignore is the connection between terrestrial life, which didn't have, the plant still existed, only in different form. But when you have that, the streams and the rivers carry that organic matter into the ocean. So what they really see is this organic matter and particulate and dissolved stays pretty abundant in the ocean throughout time. It doesn't really get used up quick enough. But what it would do, if you're recycling it, you probably have less organic matter fall to the very bottom. And when you see that throughout the Permian, the animals that lived on the bottom and relied on food falling all the way down to the bottom, their sizes got smaller and smaller, which would be what you would expect if there was less productivity because the phytoplankton died. So and they see this both in the gastropods, the snails and types, and the clams and scallops or whatever. The coral that mostly went extinct before the end Permian, they survive now, and they've survived for at least 220 million years by creating a symbiotic relationship to secure more CO2. You take in a photosynthesizing algae, and that provides sugar and oxygen. And then the coral, which is an animal, when it digests that, it releases CO2, which can be recycled back to the algae. And when you make a reef, making that calcium carbonate reef, you're releasing CO2. You take bicarbonate and rearrange it, and CO2 gets released in the process. So this symbiotic relationship is what's allowed all the coral now to live for 200 million years, where the old ones didn't have that symbiotic relationship from everything we can tell from the fossil records. So the coral respiration, the reef building, both provided CO2, and that was another way to secure CO2. So back to this question of, why would phytoplankton be so sensitive? Why would you get this blackout as CO2 decreases in the ocean? And the first thing to think of is, when CO2 enters the water, it interacts with water molecules, and it changes the bonding so that a hydrogen atom escapes, and you're left with bicarbonate, which is HCO3, is in the red curve. And then you can have another hydrogen leave, and you're left with a carbonate ion, the green curve. And how much CO2 or bicarbonate or carbonate ion exists, its percentage, is going to depend on pH, because pH is going to tell how much hydrogens can bounce on or off of these molecules. Well, so what would we expect? Well, if you have you get down to 1,000 parts per million, pH drops to about 7.8, below 8. But if you're at where the Carboniferous and early Permian happened, where a number of records show the pH or the CO2 concentration dropped to about 100 to 200, pH gets to about 8.5 or higher. And at 8.5, when you look back at that first curve, you see CO2 almost goes non-existent. It's mostly all bicarbonate ions and carbonate ions. And so if you're a phytoplankton that evolved when you had high CO2 and it was easy to photosynthesize, now you have trouble getting CO2. And so that would explain a lot of why you had that phytoplankton blackout. And what we see now, and what a lot of plankton do, what reef builders, shell builders do, they use the most abundant form of inorganic carbon, which is the biocarbon. They make their shells with it. They use it for photosynthesizing. And is bicarbonate ions how C4 photosynthesis helps modern day plants do better than they would. So bicarbonate ions is the thing. What most of the plants of phytoplankton have done now, whether it's bacteria or algae, they have carbon concentrating mechanisms, which has allowed them to survive this way. And what they do is they take in the bicarbonate ions. Because it's an ion, it doesn't pass freely through a membrane like a neutral CO2 would do. So it has to be pumped in, but it traps the CO2. It can't escape. And then what it does is it transports that bicarbonate ion into, in this case, called a carboxysome, where you have rubisco is the enzyme that takes CO2 and joins it to make the sugars using the energy from the light reactions. So you pump that bicarbonate, and then you have another enzyme that breaks the bicarbonate back to CO2 right in the presence of rubisco. So you have much more efficient photosynthesis. You have a much better way of concentrating carbon dioxide for better photosynthesis. It's mostly speculation, but nobody thinks prior to the Permian and extinction that these concentrating mechanisms were very common. So cyanobacteria develop carboxysomes. Algae evolved something similar called the pyrenoids, but all based on this kind of transport from bicarbonate to carbon dioxide to the rubisco. And so the phytoplankton that lacks CCMs would have this limited growth. And they've done some experiments where you have strains of phytoplankton that don't have genes for these carbon concentrating mechanisms. They just aren't viable in our present day atmosphere of CO2. So which gives another idea of why we would have this due to low CO2. Now, the other thing about photosynthesizing is as photosynthesis sequesters carbon dioxide, you generate oxygen. And so we see as you had this, as land plants multiplied through the Devonian and then much more through the Carboniferous, that oxygen went to the highest levels ever. And it was less than 1% when the Earth first formed. But around the beginning of the Permian, all of a sudden the oxygen level started dropping. And that would make sense from the point of view is photosynthesis is no longer keeping the balance. And things are respiring and using the oxygen, and it's not being replaced by photosynthesis. And that was bad for plants for the certain reason is this rubisco that takes the CO2 and joins it to make the sugars. It's a legacy enzyme that evolved way back when CO2 was very high and oxygen was very low. And so it wasn't careful that about how it dealt with oxygen. But as oxygen levels grew, it also grabs oxygen. And when it does that, it does a process they call photorespiration that causes the CO2 that you fixed to be released and released to CO2. So you lose this energy. So the average biomass of productive modern C3 plants is lowered by 50% when you get down to 180, 220 parts per million for CO2. And 38% of that reduction is induced by photorespiration. And if you get even lower to 150, you could lose 92% of your biomass. because of this competition with oxygen. Did someone ask for a question? All right. Modern day plants, there's been a change in photosynthesis, this evolution of C4 plants and CAM plants. And they think most of them happened 25 to 30 million years ago, but different plant families have evolved C4 at different times, up to as recently as maybe 5 million years ago, because now we're going down to, we were down to lower and lower CO2 concentrations. And again, if you just think of it as a plant can absorb CO2 through its stomata, it changes it to that bicarbonate ion. But in this case, with C4, it joins it to another molecule, which has 4 carbons now, and that gets transported into where the rubisco is so it can be released as CO2. And that allows C4 plants to be much more efficient. So let me just finish this, David, and I'll get you. Pineapples, corn, cactus, the cereals and grains that have survived, a lot of the grasses developed this C4. And when you had this explosion of grasslands, because they were better evolved in dry areas to multiply, then you had this explosion of hoofed animals. So when you look out in the savannas and you look at all these hoofed animals, a lot of it happened because of the evolution of C4 photosynthesis now, because you could take advantage of limiting carbon dioxide. David, question.
What is C3, C4, and CAM?
Okay. What we refer to is C4 means that you have a 4 carbon molecule that is transporting the carbon dioxide into the rubisco. Okay. And before that, well, you had like a 3 carbon that was sort of the intermediate that gave the CO2 to the plant. So that was the change. They happen in different places with C4. And that keeps the oxygen out and the CO2 in. It costs a little, but it's much more efficient. CAM photosynthesis is crassulacean acid metabolism, which is C4, but separated day and night. So a lot of your cactus, the guy that first discovered this, you see succulent plants, like everyone know aloe vera. He was a scientist working in a lab, and sometimes he would just break off a piece of aloe vera and chew it because it was acidic. Well, he was working through the night, and he in the morning he bit off a piece, and all of a sudden it wasn't sour anymore. And so he said, what caused the chemical change? Well, they store it as an acid in the daytime, at nighttime, I mean, and then they take that acid and release the CO2, so it's lost the acidity taste, so it can enter that Calvin cycle with rubisco and then multiply. It costs a little more. A lot of your succulent plants don't grow as quickly, but allows them to grow in places like where cactus grow in succulents. So where it's warm and dry, it gives them a tremendous advantage because you're not losing water. And part of the reason why this is so beneficial is CO2 starvation increases stomata density. And so if there's not a lot of CO2, the plants respond by making more stomata.
You have to tell us what stomata are.
Oh, I thought you would know that, but anyway, sorry.
We do, but I don't think all of us do.
I have a picture right here. So to let CO2 in or oxygen in, you have an opening, and modern plants have guard cells. Some of the earlier plants like mosses, liverworts didn't, but they can open up and let CO2 in. But by doing that, they also let water out. And that works because letting in the water out helps draw the water up through the plant. But when you're in a dry area, or as things start to dry out and you add more stomata, you lose more water. So changes in C4 plants and CAM plants allowed plants to move into drier areas, which were starting to happen in the Permian. So it's the earlier plants, the big rainforest there, they had an earlier version. So they had a lot of stomata, they dried out and they died. So it was a combination of lack of CO2 causing more stomata and a drying conditions, making it too harsh for them to survive. Did you have your hand raised for something else, or does that make sense? All right. And just a case of for you with botany evolution, those lycopods in that early rainforest that collapsed, their leaves were very simple. They only had like one vein. Their roots didn't have much of a branching pattern to them. The modern day plants, what they call the megaphylls, have much more branching patterns. So we can see the veins in the leaves, and they're better at moving water and nutrients and CO2 around. So the lycopods that went extinct at the end of the Carboniferous just had a more primitive design that didn't make them as resilient as the plants we have today. We also know studies looking at low CO2. If you have low CO2, you have poor root growth. And poor root growth means you're going to be limited in getting water. So that became another issue. So why was the land drying out? Not because, yes.
Before we go away from stomata, can I just come back to that a question for you? The stomata index, does that indicate a high index, a large number of stomata or bigger stomata?
A number. It's based on density, and it's very similar to just the numbers, but it's the density of stomata per epidermal cells.
Okay.
So it's just another way of trying to give it a standard that they can compare. Because if you had you have a big leaf with lots of stomata, and you could say you have lots of stomata in something with not so big. So you look at the number of epidermal cells, and that's what the index does.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anything else? All right. So the drying out, if you go back to the Ordovician time when you had that first extinction, but you had a lot of these nascent continents forming. There were a bunch of islands, they're mostly all in the southern hemisphere, but the loss as they joined and became Pangea, you lost a lot of coastline. Now you had a lot of more inland territory, and you can have dryness happen because of heavy evaporation, but a lot of the moisture is depending on transport. If it can't get into the inland area, and I know this here in California, I have very lush on the west side of the Sierra Nevadas, but you go over to the other side and it's blocked. Reno, Las Vegas, Nevada is all dry desert country. So it's the big reason for a lot of these dry episodes. This desertification happened due to Pangea, making it harder for water to get in to the interior. And you had different lands as they collapsed. You had more mountains that could block it from coming in. So several different things caused this general drying period that had nothing to do with CO2 warming. You also, as Pangea, you have in biodiversity, you have lots of islands. You allow plants and animals to speciate and not be affected by competition from other animals. So, sort of like once those honey creepers in Hawaii arrived, they were isolated enough that they had this big burst of biodiversity. So you have all these islands that have a lot of species, and then when it starts to join together, you allow species to be invaded by other competitors. The more coastline, you have more unique shallow water for species development, you lose a lot of that. And so the loss of shallow equatorial waters led to a greater amount of extinctions just because of the way the land formed. So part of the loss of species during the Great Dying had to do more with the way the land was being formed together in Pangea. And if I go back to the giant, the big peak in oxygenation, around the end of the Carboniferous, you had a number of extremely large insects, dragonfly type insects that were about 6 foot. The only mass extinction of insects who are very adaptable to lots of conditions happened at the time where oxygen started being depleted. Once it had reached its peak. So as CO2 caused less photosynthesis, you had less oxygen, you started to have these giant insects die off because they can't pump the oxygen into their body. It's more passive diffusion through little tubes called trachea or whatever. So we see this decline And this all happened around the Carboniferous and the Permian. So they didn't make it much further through the mid-Permian, but that was the only major extinction of insects. At the same time, during the Permian, you had the evolution of amphibians that started maybe in the Devonian with fish that had fins that more like legs. Often some of them still use gills, but they could keep water in the mouth like some fish do still today. But you had an evolution of amphibians that could start breathing through their skin, which again is very passive. And so when you had high oxygen, you could have a greater evolution of amphibians. But when you have low oxygen, it's gonna be much more stressful, and they're gonna start to die off. And so we see that there was kind of a peak, and the amphibians started to die off. But at the same time, the amphibians kind of allowed other reptile-like creatures to evolve. And so you look, we'll just say synapsids, there was two kind of major groups: synapsids that became mammals, and then diapsids that became birds and dinosaurs, and then another group that became snakes and the tuatara. So if we look through the Permian, if you look at here's one clade of amphibians that came up at that time, they all started dying off by the mid-Permian. If you look at those synapsids, and probably obviously like Dimetrodon with the big sail as always, they started dying off in the early Permian. And you have some of the early synapsids, they started to appear to 779 million, but they were all gone by the Capitanian. So there was this tremendous die-off of these animals that was also happening through the Permian, all adding to this idea of dead clades walking. And so there are many theories about the in-Permian extinctions, but there's a lot of support for this idea that falling CO2 induced all these changes in the plant life, in the animal life, and it did this dead clades walking that ended up with the great extinction at the end Permian. And I'll open this up for discussion.
All right, who's got questions? Excellent. A lot of new terminology for a lot of people, so a lot of big words flying around, but I think we got a lot of the basics. My first question is that these CO2 reconstructions, and you're showing the geocarb, I'm pretty sure, are pretty suspect. They don't have very good data, and Javier has shown that they are all deficient in some way. But do you think that CO2 ever really got below 150 or 200 parts per million?
Some of the people that were looking at coal deposits came up with those numbers. And that's why I showed in the beginning two different graphs on CO2 concentrations. To say exactly how many parts per million, I think you're going to have a certain level of uncertainty no matter what. But that doesn't take away from the general decline that was there. So you can look at this general trend here. Did it only go to 250 and not to 100? Possibly. I don't know how to debate that. And I haven't been able to go through all the records and test their methods and whatever. So there's good reason to have suspicion, but I think the general tendency, the general trends would hold out this whole idea that you had very low CO2 back in that time. And low CO2 causes problems, especially for animals that evolved when CO2 was 4,000, 5,000 parts per million. And I think some people might say the Ordovician only made it to 3,000, but again, the general trend is there.
Makes sense. Okay, anybody?
I didn't put you all to sleep, did I?
Come on. Liz, please.
I was wondering about the evolution of the species. Since present-day species presumably evolved to deal with less carbon dioxide, does that mean that they're going to be more robust as carbon dioxide falls? Do they have a better chance of surviving?
I think that's what we're seeing, a combination of plants that are able to use low CO2 more efficiently, like C4 plants, CAM plants, that having seeds that allows them to weather climatic changes. And a few other adaptations makes the present day flora much more robust. And not until the middle of the age of dinosaurs, about 150, 200 million years ago, you had flowering plants. They were pretty much non-existent at the time of the end Permian. So those adaptations were better seeds, greater symbiosis with insects that allowed better pollination instead of just random wind pollination. So there's a number of adaptations that have happened. So as CO2 has collapsed, like we see from the Jurassic down to here, we're not seeing the same kind of extinctions as we hit back here, because it's really two different kinds of flora that have different adaptations and susceptibilities to low CO2.
Jim, is there a natural turnover of species at all for some sort of time frame that you've identified?
There is that graph I showed you with the triangles going up and down. There's this natural background of extinctions that are always happening. And so when you look at these mass extinctions, you're kind of saying here's plus or minus a certain amount of originations and extinctions. And when you're outside those uncertainty levels, that's when we get concerned with these mass extinctions. So what causes them at different times? Sometimes it's competition. Sometimes your genetics, you allowed you to evolve for certain conditions, and those conditions sort of disappear or become more stressed. So we're going to have extinctions at our level. When you see animals going extinct now due to human interference, that becomes more of a concern, and it's happening. That happens too quickly as we kind of remove habitat. So how we separate that out from the natural flow has to be considered. And so I hear people say, oh, if we see an extinction now, it doesn't matter because it's happened all the time. It has happened all the time, but sometimes humans have caused it in ways that they couldn't have by overhunting or destroying of habitat. Where I worked in Sierra Nevada, it was 49er country. And the 49ers came in, and I can look from where my field station was. The North Yuba River runs there. Well, they took the river out of the stream bed, put it in flume boxes so they could dig the gold out of the gravel in the bottom of the streams. To build their forges, make tunnels into the mountainside. They cut down all the trees. So you look at the habitat there, it was totally destroyed. It was like a moonscape almost from what the 49ers did. It has now come back as one of the more bountiful wildlife places in California. So if you're not destroying the habitat, you're not overhunting it, this life will come back. And that total destruction happened over a period of 150 years, and has come back within 100 years. So it's these plants and animals are fairly resilient if we don't massacre them. I'll say the same thing with whales. I've taken people out on looking at whale watch trips. And 30 years ago, we might find one humpback as we went out to the Farallon Islands. And now I can sit at the beach and I can watch 6 or 7 of them reaching and eating right from my car, sitting in the parking lot. So it's amazing. Once we stop hunting a lot of these animals, they're able to come back. Long as the habitat stays intact. But what I'm arguing here is say again. I heard someone say something.
I didn't say anything, and I asked Jim, but you were leading on to the follow-up question, which is if there is a natural turnover, are there anyone thinking what's the natural period for our extinction in that case?
I don't think I'll ever die, but that's my own bias. It's hard to say. We're pretty adaptive, and we make use of fossil fuels. And I think if we try to go back to the old days, we might have a less of a chance. But I think as we have problems, we can figure out ways to do it. But you have to have a good ecological sense of what could work. I can't see living in really dense cities. That my happy place is out in the mountains and out in nature, and there's a lot of that there. But, agriculture has done well. But, when people talk about humans causing extinction, I mean, there are people that just rabid about it. They just think we're ready to go within the next 10 years if we don't stop CO2 from going. And that, I think, is total hokum. How far, what else could happen? Could an asteroid hit? Could there disease take us over? Some kind of evolutionary disease that we don't know how to stop? Or we use bad vaccines that can't stop it but hurt you? Those kind of things I don't know how to guess. I mean, we're not impervious to that possibility. But if I look at, say, coral, they've been around, their species have been around, or related species, over 200 million years. So, and I think part of that has to do with symbiotic relationships. And if we have good symbiotic relationships with our ecosystems, I think we could persist for a very long time. Yeah.
Corin,
Corin.
you have to unmute, Corin. I muted you earlier. Here.
You press, he's got to press his own button, I think.
Yeah, he knows. He'll do it.
That's it. I pressed the right button. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can I ask if I've got the drift of this right? So you can see on this graph, which you kindly provided, that at the end of the Permian period, the CO2 is going up a lot. So people argue, it's because high CO2 will cause mass extinction. However, you've demonstrated that low CO2 and was causing lots of extinctions because the plants didn't know how to cope with it. There was less oxygen as well, and also we had Pangea. So therefore, the mass extinctions had already happened before the rise in CO2 at the end of the Permian. Is that roughly right?
That's roughly right. And that's, if you see this end Permian extinction from the framework of dead clades walking, it makes sense. If you're looking at extinctions as a one-time event with a sudden extinction over just a few thousand years or maybe even a million years, then you're looking for a much narrower cause. And and then that's why you kind of gravitate to, oh, look, here's a place where CO2 is rising. So and we know CO2 must cause a lot of warming, and that's debatable too, how much it would cause. It depends on that framework of time where you look at what causes these extinctions.
The concept of dead clades walking, just to summarize, the concept of dead clades walking is that people think that these events take place in a short period of time, but you're saying in reality, it takes tens of millions of years for any groups of animals to either die out or morph away into something different. And so it's practically impossible to mark some kind of extinction event with some weather or climate or other kind of event, because it's so continuous.
Absolutely. And especially in this case, what's continuous is you evolve in high CO2 and now there's this continuous decline, and you're losing species all along the way, which means you're losing ecosystems along the way. And the ramifications of that keep increasing until you had very low biodiversity by the time you got to the end Permian.
Yeah, pinpointing extinction events is great for newspapers. They love that, but it's really not reality.
And I think it's part because of the belief that an asteroid caused a great extinction in the Cretaceous and all the dinosaurs to die. But there's some debate on that because some of the dinosaurs were dying before that. So, and they also go to a volcanic eruption as a very unique time-specific eruption that could cause an extinction. So I think they have their blinkers on, only looking at it a very short time frame, and so they miss this dead clades walking ability. And from what I'm reading, I'm seeing more people start to think, yes, this dead clades walking is something. Now, what time frame do you want to use to justify anything? That depends on how you want to look at it. But my guess is what we're going to see as we get more proxy data, they're going to appreciate this dead clades walking idea more and more.
Who else? Tony. Orin, I'm muting you. Tony.
There's a lot said about the giant animals that lived in North America dying out fairly quickly, and the general view is that humans hunted them to extinction, when I think that there probably weren't enough humans to cause that devastation. So it may be a similar thing with gradual changes to climate, causing these extinctions over a longer period of time. When they disappeared, it seemed rapid, but the conditions for the demise may have been there beforehand.
Yeah, and you really changed the way the Great Plains or the grasslands or where these different animals were living. So there was a change in climate. What I'm looking at is, I looked at the savannas in Africa in the Sahara Desert. Well, 8,000 years ago, the Sahara was grassland with lots of lakes and lots of tribes. And then with a slight change in, and I think it probably has to do with the way the sun moves, the intertropical convergence zone is where all the moisture happens, moved a little further south. All of a sudden, the Sahara went into the biggest desert you'd ever seen. And that happened just in a matter of 1,000 years. And so whatever lived in the Sahara, if it didn't have a place to migrate to, was gone. But I think the big animals in North America, you sort of had the small constriction through Mexico and Central America kind of made it harder for them to get down there, or at least find habitat that fit. And you have saber-toothed tigers that died out. Well, if they didn't have big game to eat, then they're gone for that reason. So there's a lot of natural changing climates, and that's what I say. There's many theories for how these extinctions happen. So, but I think you're right. And there are a few people that argue differently than just humans overhunted them. So humans contributed, because you find spear tips in the side of a mammoth, so that's your data point. But there's other things that had to be going on.
My understanding is that humans did it. It didn't, if you give them 20,000 years, they could take down a lot of big megafauna. But Tony, just for your reference, Graham Hancock has, I think, a different explanation. You could look. I'd be interested to learn because I think he said no, that was impossible. But I forget what he put forward as an explanation for those animals going away.
And, there's an idea that some disease got brought in. And if they brought hunting dogs, it might have carried a canine rabies or something. I look at Hawaii, they're struggling with a lot of species going extinct, bird species, because of mosquitoes that were brought in 150 years ago. And they're bringing disease up. And you have people that moved up and they're planting bromeliads that hold the water and become nice places for mosquitoes to breed. But that's all it takes. So, here I had some animals go extinct out of the Farallon Islands because people brought mice out there when they used it as a place. So there's smaller things that could make that change. And if the mouse doesn't eat you, it might bring a disease that can be easily spread. So it's not an easy story on any of these things. So,
Jim, what's your theory on gigantism in the Cretaceous? Animals or dinosaurs got as big as they ever got, and they weighed so many tons. There are a bunch of theories on this. What's yours?
I'm really am at a loss to, I can just say, oh, well, they had more food, it was a little bit warmer, so they could, it wasn't such a problem of heating their bodies. You could name things that might support that largeness, but there are also some things that didn't get large. So I don't know.
Plants, a lot of plants were giant, right?
Some, you've got our redwoods now, which are probably about similar heights. So if you had enough moisture, I just kind of think, well, some things have the genetics that allow them to keep growing until they reach a limit. And you find it on, you had giant tortoises on land on certain islands. They weren't that big if they were on the mainland. So how much is a loss of predation allows you to keep growing bigger?
So you think it's more genetic than environmental?
Well, I would never separate the two. I think you can have a genetic thing that allows you to deal with the environment better or worse.
What about the idea that the Earth was spinning faster, and so there might have been a bit less gravity?
I've never delved into that one, but who's pushing that one?
There's like 10 or 12 big hypotheses for gigantism, and this is one of them.
Right. I know the slight change in spinning, people look at the way it affects currents. There was a few folks out of MIT and Harvard, but they didn't kind of say there was a lack of gravity. So
the day was shorter, and there was probably a little bit less gravity, but maybe it's tiny. Don't know.
Yeah, I don't think it would make that big a difference. So you might not be able to slam dunk like you could, but
yeah. Well, okay. Anybody else?
I didn't put you all to sleep, did I?
We're going to have Jim back because he's got several amazing talks, and I'm very hoping we can get him back for his wildfire talk, maybe at the beginning of the year sometime.
Sure. I'd be glad.
That's a really good one. Liz?
I just had a question about the rising carbon dioxide levels at the end of the Permian. Is that well documented that it was due to volcanic eruption? And if so, why would there have been so much volcanic eruption?
The Siberian traps is what they look at that time, and they see there was a magma that the CO2 released was mostly through the magma that was going through soils that had a lot of carbonates in them to release the CO2. So that's a lot of what they think is caused it. But they were up in the Siberia. They're far away from a lot of the rest of the continent. So, but they think it spread enough CO2 to cause this warming, or at least for them to see it in their proxies for how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. So, so yeah, look up if you know it by Siberian traps. When I mean, that's just what they call them. So,
but that would have been tectonic, right? So there would have been a time at which several continents or plates crashed together.
Well, that's that whole time era is when you go from a lot of separate islands. Some of them are moving north, some of them are crashing together. You're forming Pangea, so there'd be a lot of tectonic activity. Exactly where and how much CO2 it would release, I don't know how to measure that. But the explanation with these Siberian traps is the magma oozed up through soils, sediments that had a lot of carbon in it.
Did that intriguingly answer your question, Liz?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. Fascinating.
Has to have something to do with all the tectonic activity. Anybody else?
David, yes. Sorry, Jim, I interrupted you.
No problem. You go.
Well, I was just, as David just mentioned, tectonic. So, this view that in 200 million years' time, the South Pole will be basically at the equator. Are the people trying to second guess just, what the magma effect of such a move might be, and those implications?
I haven't studied that to really say, but I have trouble believing that you can predict that the South Pole is going to go to the equator, just because it's been there for a couple 100 million years, basically. So again, that's why I haven't paid much attention to that. but you have part of the African Rift Valley where that's starting to separate. So there's going to be movements. And I guess partly because I don't think I'll live that long. I don't really
Well,
care.
David Attenborough will be here to document
Oh, really?
him.
Jim, if I may ask, do you find that most of the strong environmentalists who are keen on the global warming theories, do they actually accept that CO2, high levels of CO2, would be a good thing if it wasn't for the fact that they think it will also warm up the Earth uncontrollably? Do they agree that there's a benefit to CO2, or are they blind to that as well?
I think some will. I would have, when I entered college, I was a believer in global warming being a problem. And I didn't want it to, my goal in life was to make a sound environment as possible. But as I did my research, I started to change my ways. But, in some ways I didn't, say, oh yeah, CO2 helps photosynthesis, but this seems a lot worse. And the environmentalists that I argue with, they just believe, well, it causes some warming. Everybody agrees. And I say, yeah, I agree there's a greenhouse effect, but I don't agree that it's catastrophic. And I don't agree. I think that the saturation point has pretty much been reached. People talk about heat waves. That's mostly suppressed convection, not due to CO2 radiation issues. So there's so many aspects to it that I think people are just overwhelmed with fear that to talk about it as, oh, it's also beneficial, just, is a minor point to them.
Mm-hmm.
I will take this opportunity to plug Jim's book. I've just put it, not for the UK Amazon, but for the US Amazon. You can find it's called Landscapes and Cycles, an environmentalist journey to climate skepticism. And I would say good storytelling.
Yeah, I wrote that 2013 in response to the butterfly issue and pika. They were local animals, and then the polar bears and everything else. It's a little outdated from that, but I think it addresses, all those fears that these animals are going extinct that aren't. So thank you, David.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else? Final benediction. I want to know about gigantism. I'm going to go talk to GPT right now.
When I can't answer a question, then I hate you because I have to go look it up a little myself. So.
I don't think we'll resolve it anytime soon.
David, the theory that you heard there or have read about the spin rate changing and therefore gravitational force would change, if it is true that, let's say, the rate of spin reduced.
Oh, it did, but maybe not much.
The only place where you'd feel a change in apparent gravity would be at the equator, or anywhere on the periphery of the spin axis. If you're at the North Pole, it'd be exactly the same.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. So
Yeah.
it'd be, at temperate latitudes, you'd only have half or whatever effect they thought that they might see on gravity.
That's right. And there's a big one is about oxygen. If there's more, Jim, how much oxygen was in the atmosphere 150 million years ago?
Well,
more, less, the same?
Carboniferous, you went up to 32 to 35%. Then it dropped lower, and it's been coming back. I don't know if I could go.
So less O2 that in the Jurassic and Cretaceous.
Up there you go. So but I've seen different methodologies, different
Jurassic.
But they had it up to 30. Some people say 32 parts per million, and then it dropped down to 12.
32%, I think you mean.
32%, yeah.
Yeah. So it was lower in the Jurassic.
In the Jurassic,
and
it's lower than what it is today. And then it's climbed back up. And
the Cretaceous, so that, I think the Cretaceous was the most gigantism. So that's not a, I don't know what We need a gigantism expert to come talk to us.
Well, I can say my mother was 5'6", my father was 5'10", and I was 6'5". So
There you go.
and I blame it all on gravity.
It's probably the CO2. It's a correlation.
I was worried about, so I married a wife that was 5'3".
Oh, perfect. Okay.
My son is 6 foot even.
Okay. Any questions? Mike, are you there? Anybody have a last question for Jim Steele?
Are there any other topics that people would like to hear about other than fire?
How good are you, Jim, on radiative transfer?
We've covered that.
I'm fairly good. Will Happer and I are good friends, and he's given me good credit for understanding what he says, because we've had some good
Right.
talks.
Right, so then we have to say downwelling radiation, don't we, David?
Yes, down radiating high energy radiation.
Infrared radiation.
Yeah. Oh, for the greenhouse effect, yes.
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
some point, David, I'd like to take that discussion again a bit further, but maybe not at this point. I was looking at the amount of downwelling IR radiation that we get compared to the upwelling radiation at any one given time from SURFRAD data in the States. And it's staggering that something like 60 to 80% of the upgoing radiation long wave appears to come back down again as long wave. And I just don't see how that all fits into what we're saying about the way in which radiation is absorbed and changed. So the thermalization thing, but maybe that's not for now. It might be a rabbit hole you want to avoid at the moment.
I think some people are have been run through the ringer on that for the last month or so, but I think we should, and I'd love to have someone come talk to us. Every time I see one of those diagrams with the energy budget, I always see different numbers. So
yeah, I hate those energy budget diagrams. It seems very, very black and white for a constantly changing system.
actually, Clive Best is going to come speak with us, I think, in June. And he'd be a guy we could talk to about. Of course, he has many other good things. But we'll come back to it. Don't worry.
Here's a question that I've had on that issue. If you can have this long wave being radiated back to Earth, so it adds to the heat, but now the Earth as a solid radiates the entire spectrum, not just the CO2 waves, and now some of that heat escapes through the atmospheric window.
Through the window, yeah.
So it constantly is diminished. Every time it warms the surface, it loses some through that window. And how long does it take? And I've not been able to find anyone that has been measured that or estimated that. And the other issue is, if it's all the collisions that you have with nitrogen and oxygen, how long does it take for new collisions to go back to CO2 or water and now release it up in the upper atmosphere? So there's the timing of all that. What I see too many people say, oh, it's trapped. And I said, well, no, it's very dynamic. And but I don't see people really exploring that dynamic as much as they should.
That's exactly the debate we're having last week, really, or we're scratching on the edge of that debate last week.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot that one could go into there, but it's a big rabbit hole, and it does involve a lot of physics. But I think you're right. Firstly, you said that let's take the simplistic view that CO2, for example, absorbs this radiation and then re-emits it in all directions. And it's going to be at the same wavelength that it absorbed it at, and some of that will come down and hit the ground. You're absolutely right. That's then absorbed by the ground, which will re-emit it in the complete spectrum of long-wave radiation, most of which will then escape to space, some of which will be caught by CO2 and brought back down again. So that heat will eventually mostly escape to space because of that process you just described.
I believe most of it will go up through convection, and the concept that it's continuously hitting the earth and then going out through the window, I don't think the window is responsible for the majority. I think the window is responsible for a certain amount. I don't know what.
You say 12 to 20%, but if it can go through other places that are not absorbing, if you're in a place where it's dry, and I know backpacking in the desert, I've been sunburned while I was backpacking, and my water bottle froze at night because the heat escapes
Sure.
very without the water there. So it depends where you are. And once you get up above where water is precipitating out, anything that's being released at those levels is pretty much going out without any interception from the water. So there's that issue at what elevation.
Well, we've been discussing that, and the CO2 is constant all the way up, and CO2 does a tremendous amount of dethermalization the higher you go.
Right.
So above the troposphere, or toward the top of the troposphere, CO2 is very busy turning thermal radiation into long wave radiation.
The phase changes of water are never taken into account because we don't know what the hell.
Hey, Micah.
In all of these scenarios, the evaporation of water, condensation, cloud formation, all of those huge energy transitions, because we don't know, we can't predict them. We don't generally know what's going on any given day over the entire planet, or we're not modeling that, not able to model it. That it's just not included in that picture that's being painted of the energy transfers. So it's so much more complicated than that simplistic diagram.
Jim, can you stop sharing screen?
Oh, yeah. Let me.
Just to let everybody know, Jim's guide for Micah's guide for this book was Jim Steele. They worked together, and Micah's here to say hi to his friend Jim.
Hi, guys.
Hey, Micah,
Hi.
great work.
Thanks a lot.
And,
I have news for you. I have news. Someone just contacted you via the website today and said she wants to buy a hard copy of your book.
Really?
Yeah, she'll pay the money.
That's cool.
Yeah. So I'm suggesting, there's not a profit center for us. But
Yeah.
if she wants to give you a tip, I told her she could. But then I've been tweeting today that anybody who wants to buy the hardcover book for a Christmas present, it's only $60 plus shipping.
We have to put a Christmas design on it.
Oh,
Then
yeah.
everybody will buy it.
Okay.
I haven't got any royalties yet.
No, unfortunately.
We need to give one to Jim, yeah.
There, I think.
Oh.
There's Jim in California. There's all your friends.
Yeah.
I got to give Micah props. Great work, great ideas,
All right. Thank you.
and great hair. You're able to overcome a lot of problems there.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next week with Tom Nelson.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.